Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another podcast. Again, thank you for tuning in. We're really excited about today's episode because we have a guest who's here in Mexico leading a Mexican company. So we're very excited to get to know a little bit more about Warren Levy. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Jaguar E&P. Jaguar E&P is a Mexican private company established in 2014 by Grupo Topaz with a strong conviction of strengthening Mexico's national energy industry and developing their communities. He has an extensive experience in developing natural resource companies for more than 24 years in more than 20 countries. He has contributed strategically to the economic growth and development of the energy industry in Latin America. What's really interesting about all of this is that Warren is a fellow Canadian who studied engineering at Queen's University, yet he's made such a big impact in Latin America. So that's really interesting. We can't wait to hear more about it. So Warren, thank you so much for being here today.
Really glad to be here with you guys. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, no problem. Warren, we really want to get into kind of where you started, and it's really neat to see that you grew up in Toronto, which is probably one of the melting pots, we would say, of Canada. So you were always around different cultures and different people, and your father worked for Exxon for 31 years, and you got to travel with him and see the international world, and that really piqued your interest into oil and gas. But you originally decided that, hey, I would graduate, I would go into oil and gas, but only spend about 6 months there, make some money, travel the world, and then quit. So it was a pretty interesting, dynamic that you had in the beginning of your thought process. But now we're 27 years later and you're still here, you're thriving, you've been extremely successful. Can you take us back to those beginning stages when you thought that you would only be here for a few months, and what kept you in the industry?
When I graduated, I was originally thinking that I would continue my education, do a master's or maybe even a PhD, but I was looking for an opportunity to replicate something that my father had been able to do, which was work overseas for a period of time. At the end of my career, my father worked in Kenya and ran Exxon's operations in Kenya. And seeing the growth that he had, learning a different language, getting to see a different culture, I was fortunate enough to be able to go visit him multiple times when my parents were living there. Was really, really valuable to me. And I thought if I could find a way to do something, work outside of Canada for a period of time and then come back to North America, that it would be an interesting way to start my career and give me some space between, doing a bachelor's in engineering and then going on to do a master's. Once I got to Venezuela, which was the first place that I started to work, and realized that the ability to work in a different culture and live in a different place provides a richness to life which is just unobtainable by going for a vacation or visiting a place. And starting to develop friendships and experiences in different countries around the world, it becomes somewhat addictive, where you want to see something new and go to a new place. Learning how to not just speak Spanish, but work in Spanish and live in Spanish, created a lot of opportunities for me around Latin America. And while I did do a couple of years in Asia, which was hugely valuable to me as well, I think what I developed was a very deep fondness for Latin culture, for the importance of family, for the importance of the health of the community, and wanted to see if there was some way that I could do something to help. And Jaguar is kind of a culmination of that, of the idea of building companies that have a benefit for the places the company is working that goes beyond just providing employment.
That's awesome. How about, how did you deal with the different downturns over the last 27 years? Was there ever a period where you thought, I want to get out of the cyclical business, especially as a business owner? Or were you just like, this is just part of the nature of the business and we're here for the ride?
I think whenever you're talking about a cyclical business, you have an additional layer of challenge, which is you don't have the idea of a stable career environment for people to work in their whole life. Most people that work in the extractive sector are going to face 2 or 3 periods of their life where they're either without work or their job is at risk. That's compensated on the other side, that when times are good, packages and opportunities and things tend to be very, very attractive. But what I do think it does is it keeps you out of being locked in a rut, where you're doing the same thing over and over again, and then you wake up and you're 15 years later and you haven't really had to rethink what you're doing or how you're doing it. The industry kind of shakes you up constantly. And the ability to operate successfully and work successfully in an environment where the single most important factor to the success of most energy companies is the price of oil and gas, which is completely outside of our control. So you start to realize that there are so many other things that are really outside of your control, and making good decisions, working well with people, being respectful are things that create the optimum amount of value irrespective of what's going on in the world. And that creates a resiliency in the people that are in our industry that I think is unique. The mining sector faces very similar challenges, and I think you have that same type of resiliency in the mining sector as well. But when you look at somebody from our sector, the idea of going to a new country to drill a well in 10,000 feet of water or in the middle of the jungle is not something we see as scary. It's something we see as exciting. And when you look at most other people, the people I grew up with, the people that I work with, they would see that as being very daunting. Some would find it exciting, but they would see it as being very daunting. And I think that part of the industry is something that keeps those of us that go from just working in the industry to being part of the industry and dedicating their lives to it as something that is really, really exciting to work in.
So Warren, you worked your way up from being a field engineer to a sub-geo market manager in 9 short years at Schlumberger. And, before you really started the companies that you're at today and being a part of Jaguar, you started in a big organization. Can you talk about, what made you successful in that organization and feeling of being able to move up that fast while you were part of such a I would say like a big ship where a lot of people have to follow some sort of succession plan in order to get to where you did?
I think Schlumberger is unique in some senses because the company believes at its core in 2 things. One, it believes in diversity. So having grown up in a place like Toronto, which is so multicultural, I don't think I faced some of the earlier barriers that many other people in the company face of just getting used to working in a multicultural environment. And then the other piece of it, I think, is, Schlumberger as a corporation believes in this idea of giving you more responsibility until you break. And in some ways, it's an aggressive and difficult environment to work in. But in other ways, if you have ambition and if you have drive and if you're dedicated and committed, you will be given increasingly more responsibility until you reach a level where you can no longer handle it. And then, people will either need to take a position in a lateral move or in a support function before they can continue to grow. But it is an organization at its core that believes that to give you as much responsibility as you're capable of handling. And I had the important plus of having a number of mentors early in my career that had been successful at Schlumberger that were able to help me in terms of understanding the culture, understanding the ways to be successful. I think the biggest challenge for me was switching from Latin America to Asia, where the dynamics of the company were very different, the cultures were very different. But the experience of being able to grow inside of a company and be running effectively 2.5 countries at 28 years of age, I think is pretty unique. And Schlumberger has been very effective at developing talent very, very quickly. They also put in a huge amount of time in the training and development of their professionals. So in your first couple of years in the organization, you may spend 12 to 16 weeks a year in training. And as a result, if you're able to absorb the training and put it into effect, you can move very quickly in the organization. That said, it's an organization that is challenging from a personal perspective because you cede a lot of the control about where you live and what job you do to the corporation, much more than in traditional companies. And when I left, we tried to take some of those experiences and say, what were the positives, but maybe be a little bit more human, a little bit more family conscious going forward, because it is a tough place for families to be involved with.
So let's talk about when you left. And so in 2015, you decided to leave, even though you were up and coming and climbing that corporate ladder, but you knew that you had 2 paths. You either continued this upward climb or you went into the unknown and take risks and get out of your comfort zone and leave this company that you had started right out of school. You decided to take the risk and just go into the unknown. Can you run us a little bit about how you came up to making that decision? Because it's a hard one, especially when you've been in a company for so long, it feels like family, to know that, okay, this paycheck, this comfort, I'm no longer going to have that. What made you kind of take the jump?
I think in my case, if you talk to mentor entrepreneurs, it's a combination of, the desire to do something on your own and probably a little bit of being naive and not realizing how difficult it is when you don't have a corporate structure around you when you don't have ready access to cash, which is what exists in especially in a company like Schlumberger, that always has large cash reserves. But what happened was initially I was approached by a customer to take over the operations of one of the country operations that they were having problems with. It was a customer that I provided support to for many years, and they were looking to make a change. That opened my eyes to the idea of looking at different options. And in the process of trying to put together the team that I was requested to put together, I reached out to people that had been my customers in the past and friends in the past, one of whom was an Argentine who had moved back to Argentina and was looking at the idea of starting a service company in Argentina as an underserviced market. And the idea kind of caught my eye. And to be honest, I flew from Malaysia over to Buenos Aires and fell in love with Buenos Aires and with Argentina, and decided very, very quickly to leave Schlumberger and move my family at the time over to Argentina and start this company. I didn't expect 18 months with no salary, 18 months of paying all the bills out of my own pocket. I didn't expect to go from being, a relatively well-paid young executive to being having to worry about having money to pay the bills every month. But I never regretted the decision, because I think in Schlumberger, what I was going to learn going forward was potentially larger geographic areas or maybe new areas of the world. But it would have been difficult to have the type of focused impact that I've been able to have by choosing to leave and do something like that.
Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. So let's talk about Estrella, a Latin American focused oil field geothermal and mining service company, which you were the founder of. You were also CEO from 2005 through the end of 2013, and you led this company from a startup through regional expansion, through 9 consecutive years of growth, to an operating base of 250 million in annual revenues with 2,000 employees. That's a big number in Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, Peru, and Ecuador. And you also took Estrella public, I believe, on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So a lot of huge accomplishments. And like you mentioned, yes, you struggled a little bit. You had to pay the bills. And, people think that success comes really fast. And, Warren left and all of the success, when in reality, there's a lot of hard things that have to happen before success happens. Can you tell us a little bit about those 10 years of hard work that didn't come easy? Do you mind sharing maybe your biggest failure and how you did to overcome it in building this business?
Yeah, I think when we started the company, there were initially 3 of us that started the company. One of the individuals left very early on. And myself and my partner really had this idea that you could create a service company that was much more customer focused. When we got into the rig business, we used to have the joke that we would paint the rig pink and name it after your grandmother if that's what it took to get the contract, which is very different to what most service companies' behavior is, where they have a standardized solution and they're trying to optimize the profitability on whatever investment that they've made. We also had the idea that we wanted people to feel that they were safe and that they were going to be somehow protected from this risk of the cyclical nature of the business. And one of the ways we did that is basically at the beginning, I hired friends. I hired people that had been colleagues in the past or customers in the past, but had crossed over to be close personal friends. And we had the idea that we would hire the individual to lead a country or the business unit, and then we would let them build the team. But always with this idea that there was a very close personal relationship that would go beyond just wanting to do a good job, but you want to go the extra mile for your friend. And that allowed us to ride through some very difficult times at the beginning, especially the downturn in 2009, where activity basically stopped in Latin America almost completely. Ride through some difficult political times in Argentina, which especially in the early years was our principal source of revenue. But by being close to our customers and having people that had this personal relationship, we started to create this dynamic where customers would come to us for solutions and would look to us for things that you would normally think about them looking to major multinational service companies. So bizarre problems that nobody else wanted to touch, with things that we would get involved with. And then we started to realize that's actually where we were making all of our money, because we had a relationship that had nothing to do with winning a bid or how competitive you were with somebody else. It really started when we started doing geothermal work. And when we moved into Chile, where nobody else wanted to go into Chile when obviously Patrol started activating again in kind of 2006, we went in very early on and ended up being one of, if not the largest service company. It was between us and Schlumberger in Chile. It's a very small market, but as a startup company, we had this experience of going into a market, listening to our customers, literally leasing a plane on the 24th of December once to solve a problem for the company to fly something down from Louisiana to southern Chile. That whole experience created a dynamic which made us closer to our customers. And what we didn't expect, but what ended up happening is, in good times, oil companies will tell service companies that it's all about price. In bad times, you actually find out what their real opinion is about what's the most important service company to keep around. And as a result, we were able to ride through downturns more easily than many other service companies did. And where we actually got strong was in the downturns. Now, that only was feasible because this group of friends that had all worked together, either in Schlumberger or other service companies or in customers, actually, we all ended up coinciding in Ecuador at one point at the same time, had this very tight bond where we weren't going to let our friends down. And in 2009, we actually went 6 months without paying salaries to management. After having grown significantly and started to become a stable company, because we started to have cash flow problems, and collectively we decided that it was more important to keep everybody else around and keep the services going and be patient with our customers when they could pay us. And I don't think that would have been achievable if we had built a conventional corporation that was, just interviewing third parties. Now, that said, that bond, while very positive, does create challenges. It's very hard to fire a friend, even if the friend isn't doing a good job. It's very hard for a friend to leave, even if personally it's better for them or for their family to do something else. So there was an emotional investment in the company, which was very positive and what made it strong and what made it grow. And when we transitioned to this very tightly held private company to becoming public and growing very extensively, I remember very clearly the first day we hired someone that I didn't personally interview. And obviously, when we got to the size of 2,000, I was interviewing almost nobody that was joining the company. And that transition was very difficult for us, and it became harder and harder to maintain the culture as the company grew larger and larger. And we had a period, I think, of our biggest single crisis was we had our only fatality in an operating environment in 10 years of operating. And that caused the entire management team to go through a very deep reflection of what we were doing, why we were there. And we had to reorganize the company to overcome the kind of collateral fallout of a very tragic incident that occurred. That the positive was, on a purely technical basis, everything was done properly. Training was done, the safety equipment was there, the motivation was there, the pre-tower meetings were there. Somebody unfortunately made a very bad decision personally, and resulted in costing his life. And we realized that it was all about motivation. It's not enough to just train somebody or give them the safety equipment. It's not enough to give them the technical training and expect them to do the job. They have to be motivated. And only if the management team is motivated can you make sure that the whole company is going to be motivated. So we had to go through a restructuring, and some of the guys that have been with us from the very, very beginning had to leave. Some chose to leave and some had to leave. And I think that was the single most difficult thing that we had to go through, which is we felt like we were dismantling the family. And that was really, really hard to deal with.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I know that had to have been a very difficult time. And anytime you have a loss of life, there's just no explanation, that you can really give to make that, sound any better than the situation that you had at hand. So that had to have been a very difficult time. So thank you for openly sharing that. Moving on to 2019, we've talked a lot about your success and the position that you took with Australia. And then, we haven't really spoke about your family. Your wife has had a full-time job. She was in 2019, she was working the embassy for Argentina. And, you're a dual career and you have kids. And a headhunter called and talked to you about a job with an E&P company named Jaguar. And then within 5.5 weeks, it was a short period of time, you were selected to run Jaguar as a CEO. So, things moved really quickly. And then you had to move your family back to Mexico in order to, start this position. What how has that support been with your family and all these moves, and how have y'all been able to keep it together? Because that would be a very difficult situation, given too that your wife, was currently working, and then you took on a huge role in Mexico to really run a company that was really based its values on having no corruption, which is really a great value to have. And for many people listening that might be in the United States are like, well, there wouldn't be corruption. What do you mean? But in Mexico and other countries, people do fall prey to that. So can you talk a little bit about, how your family has supported you through this, and then also how you have been able to transform Jaguar in Mexico as, a top leading company that's really changed the perception of, an industry in that country?
So just if I step back a little bit farther, when I met my wife, she was the press secretary for the First Lady in Colombia and had a long career in journalism and in the government in Colombia. And I actually moved to Colombia to be with her. And then we had our daughter. She has a son from her first marriage who's now my son as well, and has been with me for up until last week, has been with me for 10 years now. So the first step was moving to Argentina, which was a big ask. Thankfully, the Colombian government was kind enough to assign her to the embassy in Buenos Aires, so she was able to continue working. But both international moves that I've made with my family, post Schlumberger, which is a second marriage, there's been a lot of conversation about what are the pros and cons, what are the things we're looking for, and it's been an evolution of making sure that we can create a happy and healthy environment for the family where we go. So the move from Argentina to Mexico was particularly difficult because I received a phone call after our son Mariano had gone to work at camp in northern Maine, where he's completely disconnected for some on the order of 9-10 weeks in the summer, can't speak to anybody. So the condition on acceptance was that we needed to fly to Boston, drive to Maine to see him at his camp and tell him we're moving to Mexico, because otherwise he would have flown back to Buenos Aires to find the movers in the apartment, packing the apartment up. Thankfully, he took the challenge on with very good spirit and ended up having a wonderful experience at the American school here in Mexico City, where he ended up being the MVP of the football team and the senior athlete of the year after having never played American football in his life before coming here.
That's incredible.
So he's now gone to university. We just installed him last week, but the process of moving a family was something I was probably not conscious enough about in the early years about how traumatic it is and how difficult it is at every stage for different reasons for children and for spouses, wives or husbands to move. And there's a transition period. And what I think was different about Jaguar, and one of the reasons I came here, is every single conversation I have with the ownership team at Jaguar is first and foremost, how's your wife? How are your kids? How are you doing? Then we talk about business. And there's a level of humanity to the interaction that we have here, which now permeates throughout the company, where everybody knows that if you have a family crisis or a family issue, that's the priority. You go deal with that. The rest of the company will pick up the slack while you're off paying attention to what you're doing. And as a result, there was much more bandwidth and energy put into making sure that the family was comfortable. We faced a particular challenge here of COVID hitting us 6 months after showing up in Mexico. So we didn't manage to get installed in Mexico as quickly as we would have liked from an emotional perspective or even from a logistical perspective. But the conversations are very much about what is the pro and con for each member of the family. And I think we made the decision to leave Buenos Aires predominantly because the opportunity to be here was very important. We knew that the quality of life in Mexico compared to Buenos Aires would have some pluses as well. And I think there's a very personal factor for me, as my parents are actually retired and live in Mexico. So an opportunity to live in the same country as my parents after 20 odd years of not living in the same country, actually 30 years of almost of not living in the same country, was a particular plus. But the real attraction was Jaguar is such a unique opportunity, and the people that founded the company are genuinely concerned that people's families are happy and healthy is a great thing to find, and quite rare to find in the oil industry, where we tend to distance ourselves from families because we know we're going to have to lay people off in downturns. And when you enter into that mindset, if I get to know you and your family, it's going to be that much harder to lay somebody off in a downturn. And I think we've been able to break that paradigm a little bit in Estrella And certainly in Jaguar, where we have made the decision of not firing anybody during the pandemic, no matter what, and that we're gonna find ways to protect people and their families and help ride through downturns and view our people as the core value and the core asset that the company has.
Mm.
That's awesome. Yes, thank you so much for sharing. And it's really important, like you touched, that these moves impact a lot the family, specifically the children and the spouses. And it's not an easy move, and there is a transitional period. But I'm glad that it's worked out, and you seem very passionate about Jaguar. So it was a great opportunity. You took it. There was a lot of risks involved, and that's what drives a lot of people. And that's how you you get these big challenges, but it pays off in the end sometimes, right? No risk, no reward. So to end the podcast, we had one last question for you. And it's, throughout your career, you have been a champion for diversity and inclusion, having worked in a major corporation to now CEO of an E&P company. What do you see as the limiting factor holding women back from taking risks compared to their male counterparts? Or why are women not being offered some opportunities, like taking operations, running a team, being CEOs? Or do you think it's more of a lack of women not raising their hand to take these challenges? Or like, what have you noticed in the last 20 plus years around you of what you think is one of the challenges that it's holding women back?
So I used to think, and would probably say was the traditional line, that there are a lot of logistical factors that make it more difficult for women. And certainly some of those issues exist. I think over time, certain countries have evolved and made facilities more accessible for both genders to be present, or there's been more consciousness in hiring, and I think some of that has started to permeate into the educational ranks, where there are more women with the technical skill sets that the oil and gas companies are looking for that are available. But I now think it's more to do with mindset. And I think through some very extraordinary young ladies that work for us here, is we have operations in the north of Mexico where there are significant security challenges, and there are particular extra layers of security risk for women. So the traditional answer is women can't go there. It's not safe, because unfortunately women are exposed to a different level of risk than their male counterparts. And morally, I think most people rightly view that risk as being unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I had a young lady in our office not too long ago said, the comment was made, we can't send women to the operations around Reynosa. She said, not yet. And that opened my eyes to the idea of, if you have the mindset that there's a challenge that needs to be overcome, the challenge will be overcome. It may take time, it may be difficult, it may require some false starts and some errors in how you start it, but it will be overcome. If we enter with the mindset of that can't happen, we will persist with the same situation where there are barriers which are unfair and ultimately are not allowing companies like Jaguar to take advantage of the extraordinary talent that's available in a diverse community. And there's more value in diverse teams. It's been proven time and time again that having multiple viewpoints, multiple backgrounds, multiple ages, multiple genders in working teams is the best way to optimize productivity, is the best way to find unexpected solutions to problems. And I think, unfortunately, in our industry, we still have this mindset that accepting the fact that there are different levels of opportunity for men and women is okay. That it's understandable because of all the challenges, or it's understandable that at the end of the year, or the end of a 30-year career, on average, women are going to be half a step behind their male counterparts, because on average, women are going to have children and be on maternity leave for a period of time. So we've decided, with a lot of input from a lot of the extraordinary women that work for us, that we need to do a lot of things to change the mindset in the company. And some of the things seem almost counterintuitive. We've changed paternity leave in the company. We insist on men taking paternity leave. And that what we think that will do is help to balance some of the expectations going into long-term parenting that will allow women to share the load a little bit with their husbands in the early years of childhood, that will hopefully start to level the playing field, and not accept that something that is currently impossible or unacceptable
is the way that things should be. We're saying the way things should be is that the opportunity in operations is completely independent of background, and that we want it to be entirely driven by, emotion, drive, passion, capability, all of the types of things that are in a true meritocracy are what will drive opportunities being provided to people. And then finally, the other thing that we're doing is we've been tracking gender bias and background bias in pay from day one, and we're very pleased to see that we actually don't have any bias in our benefits benefits packages that we're offering to people. But what we're now trying to do is say, how do we actually promote more talent getting educated in the oil and gas industry, and be very careful about trying to ensure that in key management positions that we have a diverse workforce. So in our executive committee, we have 4 members that are women. We always, when we're going out to recruit somebody for a senior position, we prioritize trying to find female talent, not just that is qualified, but is willing to mentor and willing to take an active role in supporting the growth of young women. And then the last thing that we've done quite recently is said we can't wait for this to fix itself. So we're identifying women in the organization that want to move into technical roles that are not currently capable of doing it because they don't have the experience or the education, and providing them support to get the education so they can stay in the organization and actually move into more of a one of the departments that has typically been male dominated. The young female talent available in Mexico is extraordinarily good. We have a lot of female talent in our subsurface group, but we would like to see more of that coming into our operational teams, where we're still very male dominated, unfortunately. But we can't sit back and wait. We've got to find creative solutions. All of the things that I've just told you have not come from me. They come from people in the organization that have come up with creative ideas on how to attack the problem. And we're trying to do that across all of the different spectrums of diversity, but particularly in Mexico, where there is still a cultural bias, which is quite strong. We're trying to go above and beyond and make sure that our women that are in leadership positions get time and space to do things inside Jaguar and outside Jaguar to support the growth of female professionals in the industry.
Wow, Warren, y'all are doing a lot, and it's really refreshing to hear you speak about it. And I think a lot of people that are listening to this can learn a lot from what Jaguar is doing. And that goes on a global perspective, just not in Mexico. North America, we struggle with it just as much. And I think that the things that you're putting in place are very beneficial. So we want to thank you again for not only coming on the podcast, but sharing, your struggles with us, sharing, these amazing advice. And I think that there's just a huge future for Jaguar and everything that you're doing, and a lot of companies can follow suit. So thank you for being here and joining with us today.
Oh, thanks, you guys. I think you guys are doing a great thing here. I think it's really important that we have visible presence in the industry from professionals like you that are helping communication happen that probably wouldn't happen otherwise. So congratulations for the podcast, and very, very pleased to be invited.
Thanks,
Warren.